Hi, I'm Dr. Kim Sage. Today's video is about how women, specifically mothers with borderline personality disorder, wound their children. Now, I'm not looking to make anyone feel worse. I just posted two videos, one really about what it can look like in the severe spectrum end of BPD, and another video around really where it comes from, which I'm really hoping will provide not only some validation for victims, but for those who struggle with this disorder, who really do need compassion for how hard it is, and the fine line we walk between understanding a disorder in our childhood and still being accountable for our behavior today. And that's not, to me, an easy thing to say. I think that it's easy to say, well, you're responsible now, but we're often fueled by these old, long-term pre-existing wounds and patterns of behavior that make it difficult. So as I go into this video, I want to say it is imperative that you get treatment if you have this disorder. Remember that treatment is a newer thing for many women. I would say there's a whole generation of women and beyond who there really was never a real treatment for. DBT can be incredibly helpful, but you have to know there's a wide variation in spectrum with this disorder. And it often overlaps with narcissism and narcissistic PD, but let's just go through the core of what BPD specifically does and how it can seriously wound those on the receiving end of this disorder. I also want to say this, that in some of the research I read, as I was saying in that video before, women will say they hate their mothers. But what I did not say is that beneath all of that, they often do love their moms. There's a wound in the love. The love is hurt love, but we want to love our caregivers. We're born to be connected and nurtured and loved. And that is really the hard part, is whether you don't talk to a parent with this disorder, they're no longer in your life, you have a chaotic relationship with them, no matter what you do, even if they've died, this wound for the children of these women or adults or men too that have this disorder, it lives on in us because we want so deeply to love our caregivers. So oftentimes people will say, I have this hatred. They feel so guilty about it because deep inside there is a love or pain. Maybe it's not even, maybe love is even too strong of a word for some people, especially on the severe end. But it does create this very difficult wound that is so hard to really understand. It's so complex. So let's talk about what happens. The first really sort of issue we see with when we have a parent with BPD is that we often have a lot of trauma. And so oftentimes the parent was facing a lot of trauma with this disorder, and therefore more trauma occurred. There was unresolved trauma, or as a result of our experience with them, we were exposed to a lot of trauma. And so if we have a trauma experience in a childhood, it's going to affect how we see ourselves, how we deal with stress, what we expect in relationships, how we deal with trauma in our adult life. It is very complex. The complex nature of trauma with a BPD parent, that is a really important issue to look at. So if you have a parent who you think has BPD and you are considering therapy or in therapy, don't forget to address the issue of, did you experience trauma and what might it have looked like? This is really important, and it's important to understand that trauma and trauma-informed therapy is not something everybody has. And so you might do some research on that, but you could just know that even if there was no massive trauma, that the chronic nature of being on the receiving end of BPD as a child can be extremely traumatic and often be what we call complex PTSD. The second issue is how you develop your sense of self. If you had a parent with BPD, you often have a difficult time with your own sense of self. Who are you? Are you good? Are you bad? What does it mean to sort of internalize the working model of your parent that gave you such conflicting messages? So sense of self can be really difficult to sort out in the world. The next one is trust. You might have an issue if you had a parent like this with, how do I trust others? How do I trust myself? Trust in general, like always looking for someone to wound you, hurt you, not be there for you. To also have sort of suspicions about what's their motivation. That can be an issue. And also just, how do you trust yourself? If you weren't mirrored back that you were a whole and worthy human, and let me say that not all parents do this perfectly, we all fall down, we all fail at times, but I'm talking about a chronic sense of not being mirrored back your value and being told that you're a bad child, you're a good child, just being so confused. it can make trust in self really, really difficult. Because if your mom doesn't trust you, what does this say about your own value as a human being? The next one, and this is also very much supported in the research, is low self-esteem, right? So going along with all of that, it's hard to feel good about yourself when you often receive such mixed messages or really negative messages. And this really applies to other disorders in terms of personalities as well, from narcissism to avoidant to dependent. But what does it really mean? Who am I and what is my own value if the mirroring I was supposed to receive was so painful, chaotic, wounding, hurtful? And so what we end up doing is we internalize that bad self that gets projected upon us by the caregiver, and we become the bad self. We internalize the bad self. So if mom thinks I'm bad or dad thinks I'm bad, then I must be bad. Going back to the egocentricity of children and that everything is about them. I always tell patients it's like by osmosis. It's like divorce. And oftentimes people will say, well, in a divorce, kids often blame themselves. And people will say, well, I didn't blame myself. But it's more not even like a cognitive thought you have. It's like, if they couldn't be together and love each other for me, what does that say about me? It's by osmosis. We kind of take that on, if that makes sense. The next one is there are often high levels of mental health issues. So as a result of the borderline behavior treatment, we often have really high levels of depression, of anxiety, of PTSD and trauma and low self-esteem, let alone we might have, tendencies or traits of BPD in ourselves that with good treatment we can really work on. But we have to just start with knowing that mental health issues tend to come out of more difficult environments in childhood. It just makes sense. The next one is anger issues. If you had a parent with borderline personality disorder, the chances are that they had a very difficult time navigating their own anger and rage. And so there's this chronic fearfulness we can have from them. Now here's what happens. Oftentimes either we become like that, so we only see anger as I have to dominate and be aggressive and assertive and scary and rageful, or we learn to completely avoid anger and conflict. So we internalize, we stuff our own emotions, we don't know how to express ourselves in anger because anger equals danger. Anger is scary, so I don't do it. And we need to be able to express healthy anger in relationships. So you can see that sometimes when you get into your adult or friendships even, where you don't stick up for yourself. You tend to just back out and remove yourself. When you're done, you're done. You don't know how to resolve conflict because there was never any real modeling of what anger and healthy anger and conflict resolution look like. The next thing that happens is we often feel responsible for everyone else's feelings and emotions. This kind of goes into that sort of anxious part, that anxious attachment around the BPD development in terms of childhood, but that we often feel like we are responsible for everyone. We can be overly concerned with caretaking. We can feel like everything is our fault. So somehow it always is incumbent upon us to take care of you. And that goes back to where I've said in the videos where you become the mom, or when moms will call their daughters, or that's often daughters, but it can be sons too, their best friend. That's a lot of responsibility. It is not our responsibility as children to take care of your emotions. You have to know that. But because we grew up that way, we believe that, well, of course it is. That makes perfect sense. And that can actually even transcend to our own children, because oftentimes we want to heal our childhoods like this, and so our own children's pain is also our pain. Now, I think all parents would say that, but when the line gets so blurred that no matter what your child does, it's a reflection of you and your own feelings, there's a really good chance that you have some history of an unhealthy attachment in your own childhood that you are now projecting and blending into your children, especially as your kids become adults and they're making choices that we have a hard time separating and saying, wait a minute, this is my child's choice. Not everything is my fault and responsibility. And that's really the core. We often feel that everything is our fault because, frankly, in our childhoods, it often was. The next one is we often don't expect anyone to take care of us. And so we don't ask. We don't ask to get our needs met. We don't ask for help. We don't know how to ask for help because we spent so much time on our own trying to figure things out or rotating around that caregiver and trying to be what they needed that we often don't even recognize how to ask for help or even recognize when we need to ask for help or what's really going on inside of us. So that can be a really important skill to develop. The next one, which makes sense, is boundaries, right? When you have a BPD parent, they often have a really hard time with boundaries, with setting healthy and appropriate boundaries. And so as you grow up, you don't know what those look like. You don't know how to set them for yourself. you don't know how to push back with other people's, violation of boundaries. So boundaries in general, which I know we hear this word a lot, but it really is important. It's like, creating a bumper around where I begin and you end and vice versa. And so we need to know what those are. But if we have a childhood like this, there often weren't any. And so it's really difficult to have them in ourselves and to even know how to set them. It's like, what's the boundary? How do I even do that? And even when we do set them, it can feel really, really uncomfortable. Next one is, it's hard for us to validate our own emotions. We have a hard enough time trying to manage other people's feelings because we've spent so much time trying to avoid them or dart away from them or protect ourselves. But learning how to validate our own feelings when that wasn't mirrored back to us, that kind of goes back into the development of sense of self. We need to understand that our feelings matter. But when you have a childhood like this, and really the hallmark of BPD is a highly invalidating childhood. So you weren't validated. So how are you supposed to know how to validate yourself? So that's a huge part of it, is learning how to say, my feelings matter. I'm hurt. I'm wounded. I get to be angry at you. I'm entitled to my anger or my frustration or my sadness, and that's okay. And the next one is, we often find ourselves wanting to numb out from this story, this part of ourselves, these wounds we have. And so you can often see increased substance abuse or use or dependence, or just a general needing to lean on substances in order to handle the deep underlying pain that we often feel when we have a story like this. So just be aware that numbing can be another way that we deal. And this applies to really, frankly, any mental health issue, but it can definitely be a part of it. The next one is, we can often feel empty inside, almost like there's a shell in there. We don't know who we are. We don't know how we feel. There can be this sort of vacuum of space where we don't really know what's inside and what makes us who we are and what matters. And so learning how to build the hallmark and the steps of who you are, which is I'm hopefully going to do in this big mental health lab thing I've created. This first part is helping you understand where you've come from, but we often can not really know who we are, what we like, what we love, what makes us happy, what makes us sad. It's this sort of vacuum of space that we never really got to know how to fill. We were so busy trying to avoid, protect, enable, and engage with an adult that demanded so much from us, or that we were so unsafe from, or that we were repeatedly rejected from, that we don't really know who we are. The last one is, we often feel, and this often bleeds into sort of the idea around narcissistic PD as well, we have this shame around even existing, that at the core we are unworthy and unlovable, and we feel this just sort of toxic sense of self around who we are in the world. And that is going to play out and manifest in how we see ourselves, what relationships we choose, what partners we choose, who we have kids with, why we stay, why we leave. All the myriad of things we do as a result of these wounds often make us feel like we are not worthy of anything. What we end up doing is believing that our needs don't matter. We become caretakers. We become ashamed of ourselves. We don't know how to look at ourselves as whole humans. We're only existing as a response to someone else. And when you live your life that way, you will never choose healthy relationships, because you'll always believe at the end of the day it comes back to you, your own brokenness, your lack of worthiness, and your deep sense of shame for even being here, for existing in the world. So I hope this was helpful. If you've had a parent like this, I think it's helpful, honestly, is knowing that there's a name for this disorder, not to make those who have this disorder feel worse, but to understand that it's much bigger than just emotional neglect or abuse, that there is a entire sort of cluster of human beings who have this difficulty in their life that then put that onto their children. And as a result, once you understand that I do have a parent with this disorder, it often helps the children say, this was not my fault. I didn't create this. It wasn't because I was a bad daughter or a bad son or I could never get it right. It was that they had this massive, really meaningful difficulty, this struggle, and that's a different issue, right? But we have to start with having compassion for ourselves. We want to have compassion for those who have this disorder, and they deserve it. But we have to also look at those of us who endured this. So whether we are the ones that have the disorder or the ones that receive the impact of this disorder, understanding it helps us process and really creates a roadmap, especially if you are someone who never really understood, why do I feel this way? Where did this come from? And so people often come to my practice and say, oh, my mom was crazy, my dad was crazy. But when we really dive into it, we understand there's a cluster of behaviors and emotional responses that explain it. And it gives the person in therapy permission to say, I can separate this. This is not about me. This is about this broken, wounded parent I had. And while I'm not necessarily making it okay that they chose these behaviors, because I keep saying it's a big dilemma. How do we talk about where we come from and yet how we're responsible for ourselves? It just helps us understand it. And knowledge, to me, I'll keep saying it, really is power. And so whether you are on either side of this, I hope that you will find ways to, if you have this disorder, to figure out where it came from in yourself, to lovingly and compassionately try to get help and seek treatment. And the other side of this is, if you were on the receiving end, that you will also know that this type of parent creates a lot of wounds too. And it's important to understand your own mental health issues. Maybe your depression is about this. Maybe your anxiety is about this. Maybe your shame and low sense of self and unworthiness is about this. And understanding it will give us the roadmap to figuring out the treatment. And the last part of this is really around, if you are this person who says, okay, I'm watching all of this and it's hard for me to accept it and it hurts, but I understand that I have this disorder and I have hurt my kids or people that I love. What can I do? Because the truth is, I don't want you to feel any worse than you already feel. The first step is to get into treatment and to stay in treatment. And as a result of that love-hate splitting that can happen with borderline, it often happens with us as therapists. And oftentimes those with this disorder tend to, at some point, either love us or then no longer love us and often leave therapy. So trying to, if you have a really good therapist, work through those issues, go to your programs, consider DBT, staying connected to sources of support that can help you work on how to navigate your interpersonal distress, how to deal with your coping skills in a way that really brings out the best parts of you, how to navigate your own tendencies that can be destructive, and learning how to make repairs with your children, with your loved ones, learning how to own your part in things to really get that support so that you can say to your kids, I'm sorry I hurt you, or I'm sorry to my spouse, whatever it is, or my partner, my parent. There are so many ways to get help, but I will say this is one disorder where staying in treatment, at least until you've worked through the bulk of the challenges and you've really gotten to a place where you feel pretty good about it, it can really be life-changing. And DBT can be life-changing. And there are other treatments as well, but I would say the way we can use treatment to learn how to own our behavior, make repairs, and don't underestimate. I know you can't go back in the past and you can't take back what you may have done before, but you can create new pathways of connection and love, let's say with your kids. And you can't erase those memories, but you can get them to therapy. You can learn to talk to them. You can learn to make repairs and own your behavior, like I keep saying. And so much of that is so important because that helps your kids know that this is mommy's issue. This is actually not you. I didn't like the choice you made, but the response I had was not appropriate, and I'm sorry. Now, if you're apologizing all of the time, that's a big signal that you probably need to get some more help or work on treatment more. But don't give up. Know that there are many people with this disorder who have turned their lives around in so many incredible ways. But it usually happens as a result of getting support, learning how to navigate life in a way that is more healing than hurtful, and starting with just this, having compassion for yourself. I know that it's hard to navigate having compassion for those we can hurt, but we have to start with compassion for ourselves, that none of us are perfect. And we're all victim of our own story. And some of our stories are really painful, from where we came from how our genetics are wired, or hereditary issues we have. And so just know that starting with compassion and love, getting treatment and support, getting the right kind of support and treatment, sticking to it, learning how to take responsibility and lean in, and getting your kids or family support if they need it are some great first steps. I hope you will do that and know that never give up. You have the power to change your life. You truly do. And it won't be easy, but you can do it. So thanks for your time today. I hope you will subscribe and hit the bell for more content if you want to be notified when I put out new videos. And please feel free to share down below what your thoughts are, anything else you think I forgot. And know that no matter which side of this you're on, your pain does matter and you matter. And I hope you will find ways to get healthy and empower yourself and truly to heal your life, because you are worthy of it. All right, guys, thank you so much. Stay safe and well, and I'll see you next time. Bye.